Pedro had been a rideshare driver for a few years and had grown accustomed to the nocturnal routine. While many preferred to avoid rides after dark, he enjoyed the quiet streets, the soft music playing on the radio, and the casual conversations that emerged with passengers. That night, like many others, he drove through the silent streets of a sleeping city. Around midnight, a new ride request popped up on the app. Pedro glanced at the phone mounted on the dashboard. The pickup location was unusual, a remote neighborhood with little activity. He hesitated for a moment, but the fare was high, and he needed the extra money for the month's bills. He accepted the ride. Upon arriving at the address, he found a dimly lit, almost deserted street. Most of the houses had their lights off, and the silence was almost palpable. Pedro slowed down, looking for signs of life. That's when he saw him. A man was standing on the sidewalk, in the shadow of a large tree, making it difficult to discern his features. The man quickly got into the car without saying a word. Pedro looked in the rear-view mirror, trying to assess the new passenger. He was pale, with features hard to define in the low light. He wore an old-fashioned suit, which didn't match the warm night. The man simply nodded, indicating that Pedro should drive on. The destination was already set in the app, so Pedro asked no questions and followed the route. During the ride, Pedro tried to start a conversation. He asked about the man's day, commented on the weather, but the passenger didn't respond. He merely stared out the window, seemingly oblivious to everything around him. The strange silence bothered Pedro, but he decided not to push it. In his line of work, he had learned that not everyone wanted to talk, and that was part of the job. The ride lasted about 20 minutes, taking them further and further from the city. Pedro started to feel uneasy as the streets grew darker and more deserted. Finally, they arrived at the destination, a vacant lot next to an abandoned factory. The place seemed deserted, except for the shadows of the trees and the ruined factory. The passenger exited the car and, without looking back or saying anything, disappeared into the darkness. Pedro sat for a few moments, staring at the empty spot. He felt a chill down his spine, a sense that something was out of place. He decided not to linger and got back into the car, driving back to the city. That ride stayed on Pedro's mind for the rest of the night. He tried to shake off the strange feeling that had followed him since the moment the passenger got into the car, but it was hard. The silence, the almost ghostly presence of the man, the unusual destination. Everything seemed wrong. When Pedro finished his shift, he was still thinking about the silent passenger. Something about the way the man moved, the way he disappeared into the darkness, wouldn't leave his mind. He wondered if he would see him again, and at the same time, he felt a strange relief, knowing that the chance of encountering him again was slim. Pedro had no idea that this wouldn't be the last time he saw the man. What started as an unusual ride would become, night after night, a mystery that would pull him deeper and deeper into an abyss of fear and paranoia, where logic made no sense and darkness held unimaginable secrets. The next night, Pedro tried to follow his routine as usual. He put on some calming music in the car, something to help keep his mind off the unsettling thoughts from the previous night. The streets were busier than usual for a weekday, and he got lost in the constant flow of passengers getting in and out of the car, each with their own stories, problems, and destinations. Around 11 o'clock, Pedro parked at a waiting spot near the city center, waiting for a new ride. He was distracted, scrolling through his phone, when a new request popped up on the screen. He looked at the address, and his heart skipped a beat for a brief moment. It was the same pickup location as the night before, the same remote neighborhood. A strange sense of déjà vu hit him, but he shook his head, dismissing the thought. The city is big, he thought. It could be a coincidence. He accepted the ride, trying not to think too much about it. When he arrived at the location, a cold chill ran down his spine as he saw the familiar figure on the sidewalk. It was the same man from the night before, standing under the shadow of the same tree, wearing the same old-fashioned suit. He got into the car without a word, closing the door softly. Pedro looked at the passenger through the rearview mirror, hoping for some sign of recognition, but the man's face remained impassive. indifferent to his presence. This time, the destination in the app was different, but equally isolated. Pedro decided to try to strike up a conversation again, hoping to dispel the growing discomfort. "Good evening. How are you?" he asked, forcing a smile. Silence was the only response. Pedro cleared his throat, trying a different approach. "Are you from around here? It seems like I picked you up yesterday too." The man remained silent, his gaze fixed on the window as if the world outside was the only thing that mattered. Pedro felt the tension in the car rise, as if the air was growing thicker. He wasn't easily scared, but something about this passenger made his skin crawl. The ride continued in uncomfortable silence, with only the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the car's engine filling the void. Pedro couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even though the man was staring outside. When they arrived at the destination, a small park in the middle of an abandoned industrial area, the passenger left the car as quietly as he had entered. This time, Pedro watched more closely. The man walked slowly to one of the park's entrances, disappearing into the darkness among the trees. Pedro stayed there for a few moments, expecting to see him reappear, but the passenger seemed to have dissolved into the night. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He decided not to wait any longer and quickly left, his heart pounding in his chest. On the way back, he tried to rationalize what was happening. "It's just a strange passenger," he told himself. "No big deal. I've had worse rides." But deep down, a voice in his mind whispered that this wasn't normal. 2 nights in a row, the same passenger, the same unsettling behavior. He didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. That man was starting to take up too much space in his mind. Pedro decided that if he encountered the passenger again, he would follow his instincts. He would ask more direct questions, find out what he wanted and why he seemed to choose him every night. Part of him felt it was better to leave it alone, that some mysteries were better left unsolved, but curiosity and unease were stronger. Without realizing it, Pedro was being pulled deeper into the mystery of the silent passenger, unaware that this interest would lead him to question his sanity and confront fears he never imagined he had. The nights of work would never be the same, and Pedro was about to enter a game where the rules were unknown and danger lurked around every corner. In the days that followed, Pedro continued working his night shift, but the presence of the silent passenger hung over him like a shadow. He thought about the man on every ride, watching his passengers in the rearview mirror, always expecting to see that pale face and empty expression again. He tried to convince himself that he was just being paranoid, that he was overreacting. But the feeling that something was wrong was insistent and persistent, and then it happened again. It was a Friday night, and Pedro had already completed several rides. The city was more alive, with young people going to parties and couples heading out for dinners. Pedro enjoyed the movement, the lights, and the buzz that filled the streets. However, in the midst of this excitement, another ride request came through. When he looked at his phone, he saw the same pickup location. Pedro's heart skipped a beat. A mix of curiosity and fear washed over him, but before he could think it through, he accepted the ride. He drove to the location with sweaty hands on the steering wheel, his thoughts racing. When he arrived, the scene was the same. The man standing on the sidewalk, under the shadow of the tree, wearing his old-fashioned suit. Pedro felt a knot form in his stomach, but he kept his expression neutral. The man got into the car, once again, without saying a word. Night after night, Pedro found himself accepting rides for the same passenger, as if something compelled him to do so. The rides became a routine, always starting in remote places and ending in desolate, eerie locations. Pedro began to notice more details about the man: the absolute silence, the way his eyes never seemed to blink, the stiffness of his movements, as if he was out of sync with the rest of the world. Pedro tried on several occasions to start a conversation, but the passenger remained unshaken, his dense, oppressive presence filling the car. As the days went by, Pedro's unease grew. He began asking his fellow drivers discreetly about strange passengers or unusual rides, but no one seemed to have had similar experiences. It seemed Pedro was the only one the passenger chose, and this left him with more questions than answers. One night, after dropping the passenger off at an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Pedro decided to stop accepting rides for the man. No matter how much the passenger gave him chills, he needed to regain control of his routine and forget this strange obsession. He spent the next few days deliberately avoiding the neighborhood where the rides were requested, hoping not to encounter the man again. But even when he didn't see the passenger, his presence still haunted him. One early morning, while driving home after ending his shift, Pedro saw something that almost made him lose control of the car. On the sidewalk, at a distance, he saw the passenger. Pedro instinctively hit the brakes, his eyes fixed on the familiar figure. The man stood still, looking directly at Pedro's car. It was as if he knew exactly where Pedro would be, waiting for him. Pedro felt a deep shiver run down his spine. That encounter wasn't a coincidence. Something connected him to that man, and he didn't know what it was. Terrified and confused, Pedro accelerated, leaving the figure behind in the darkness. His heart pounded wildly as he tried to make sense of it. Why was that man there? How did he know where Pedro would be, and why did he seem to follow him? Pedro had no answers, only a growing certainty that something very wrong was happening. He decided that the next time he encountered the passenger, he would take a different approach. He needed to find out what was happening once and for all. He knew this decision could be dangerous, but the mystery had already deeply infiltrated his mind. Fear and curiosity were waging a battle inside him, and the idea of confronting the unknown was beginning to seem inevitable. Little did Pedro know that by trying to solve this mystery, he was getting closer and closer to a danger that could be far greater than he ever imagined. Pedro tried to act as if everything was normal, but the feeling of being watched followed him everywhere. It didn't matter where he was, driving, at home, or even at the supermarket. He felt as if the passenger's eyes were always on him. He started constantly checking his rearview mirror, scrutinizing every reflection in windows, trying to spot any sign that he was being followed. The nights, once peaceful, became a torment. Pedro began having trouble sleeping. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the passenger's pale face, those dark eyes that seemed to know more than they showed. Nightmares pursued him, dreams in which he was driving aimlessly with the passenger in the back seat, and the man's voice, which he had never heard while awake, whispered unintelligible things. He woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, with the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. But it wasn't just the dreams that changed. Small, strange events began manifesting in his daily life. First, it was the objects that disappeared. The car keychain, which he always left on a hook by the entrance, mysteriously vanished for 2 days, only to reappear on the back seat of the car, where he never left it. A pen from his central console disappeared, and the next night, Pedro found it in the glove compartment, along with a photo of himself that he didn't remember placing there. Things continued to escalate. Pedro was beginning to suspect that someone was getting into his car while he wasn't looking, maybe even into his home. One day, when he opened the car door, he noticed a strange smell, something unfamiliar, like a mix of damp earth and something metallic. The smell quickly dissipated, but the impression lingered, leaving Pedro even more uneasy. The climax of these events occurred on a night when Pedro decided to check the footage from his car's security camera. He had recently installed a camera as a precaution, but had never really reviewed the recordings. Sitting in his apartment, he connected the camera to his computer and began to review the footage from the past few weeks. For long minutes, nothing out of the ordinary appeared. It was just the usual rides, passengers getting in and out, the city passing by the window. Then he saw what seemed to be the passenger. Pedro recognized the old-fashioned suit, the pale figure, but something was wrong. The man appeared on camera as just a blur, an indistinct shape, as if the camera couldn't properly focus on him. Pedro paused the video, trying to understand what he was seeing. It was as if the passenger was there, but not there at the same time. He continued watching, and then something made his blood run cold. In one of the recordings at the end of a ride, he clearly saw the moment the passenger got out of the car. But the man didn't head towards the sidewalk as Pedro remembered. Instead, he turned to the car and looked directly at the camera. His eyes, though blurred in the video, seemed to be fixed on Pedro, even through the computer screen. Pedro felt a deep chill and a sense of discomfort. It was as if the man knew he was being watched and was communicating with him through the recording. That night, Pedro couldn't sleep. He sat on his bed, staring at the window, waiting to see something or someone appear. He listened to every noise intently, interpreting every shadow that moved. His apartment, once a safe haven, now seemed full of dark corners where something could be hiding, lurking. With the dawn, Pedro decided he needed to find out more about that passenger. He didn't know why the man chose him or what he wanted, but he knew the answer to the strange events was somehow connected to him. From now on, every ride would become an opportunity for Pedro to find clues, and he would prepare for any sign of the passenger. Fear and anxiety were still present, but mixed with them now was a cold determination. Pedro was resolved to follow the man, to discover where he was going and, if necessary, confront him. He could no longer live under the shadow of a faceless terror. If there was something wrong with that passenger, Pedro was ready to find out, even if the answers led him down a path of no return. The next night, Pedro was determined to put his plan into action. He knew things were getting increasingly strange, and ignoring what was happening was no longer an option. If there was an answer to the mysteries that haunted him, it was with the passenger. Pedro started his shift later than usual, waiting for the night to advance and the streets to become more deserted. He drove through different areas of the city, trying to calm his mind and focus on what he was about to do. Around 11:30, a ride notification appeared on the app. The pickup address was all too familiar. He sighed deeply, accepting the request. His heart raced as he drove to the location. The sense of déjà vu overwhelmed him. When he arrived, there he was again. The man in the suit, standing under the shadow of the tree like a spectre trapped in time. Pedro swallowed hard, trying to stay calm as the passenger got into the car. The man closed the door softly and remained silent, staring out the window as always. This time, Pedro didn't even attempt to make conversation. His thoughts were focused on what he would do after the passenger got out. The destination indicated in the app was once again a remote place, in an almost deserted part of the city, near a cluster of abandoned warehouses. Pedro followed the route, his fingers gripping the steering wheel, trying not to show the growing tension. As he approached the location, the discomfort increased. The streets were poorly lit, and the shadows of the warehouses loomed eerily over the road. He wondered how many people ever came to this side of the city, and why anyone would choose to be dropped off there. Finally, he stopped the car in front of one of the warehouses. The passenger opened the door and stepped out without hesitation, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Pedro waited until he was a few meters away before turning off the engine and getting out of the car. He looked around to make sure no one else was nearby. The night was silent, except for the distant sound of a dog barking. Pedro followed the man quietly, keeping a safe distance, his steps careful not to make a sound. The passenger walked slowly, with an upright and precise posture, as if he were in a trance. Pedro followed him around one of the warehouses, and then he saw something that left him speechless. The man stopped in front of an old, rusty door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. With a simple push, the door creaked open and the man disappeared inside. Pedro hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back and forget about it, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. He took a deep breath and approached the door. Up close, he noticed that the door was covered in strange, almost faded symbols, as if someone had scrawled drawings or inscriptions on it. Pedro didn't understand what they meant, but he felt a chill when he touched them. Carefully, he opened the door, trying not to make any noise. Inside, the warehouse was dark and damp, with a high ceiling lost in the shadows. The air was heavy, smelling of mold and rusted metal. Pedro took a few steps inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Then he saw the passenger. The man stood in the center of the warehouse, facing an old, dusty mirror, as if staring at his own reflection. But there was something strange about the mirror. The surface seemed liquid, rippling softly, reflecting a distorted image of the man. Pedro moved closer, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, the passenger spoke. His voice was low and raspy, a sound Pedro didn't expect, as he had never heard it before. The words were in a language Pedro didn't recognize, but there was something in the intonation that seemed like a chant or incantation. Pedro watched, both fascinated and terrified, as the mirror began to glow faintly, a weak light illuminating the man's face. Then, the surface of the mirror started to ripple more intensely, as if something was about to emerge from it. Pedro took a step back, panic rising within him. He wanted to run, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. He felt a presence in the air, something cold and threatening, as if the warehouse was closing in on him. Finally, Pedro managed to move. Without thinking, he turned and ran out of the warehouse, his heart pounding frantically. He didn't look back until he was back in his car, locking himself inside. His fingers trembled as he tried to start the engine. When he finally succeeded, he sped away as fast as he could, putting as much distance between himself and that cursed place as possible. The drive back home was a blur. Pedro drove like an automaton, trying to process what he had just seen. The man, the mirror, the strange words. None of it made sense. But one thing was certain. He had crossed the line of what was safe and known. From that moment on, he was dealing with something beyond his understanding. Pedro knew that by following the passenger, he had opened the door to something unknown and potentially dangerous. Now, he needed to find out what that mirror was, what the passenger was doing, and most importantly, how he himself was involved in all of this. The truth was getting closer, and Pedro was determined to find it, even if it meant facing his worst fears. The days that followed were a mix of anxiety and obsession for Pedro. What he had witnessed in the warehouse wouldn't leave his mind. The scene of the passenger in front of the mirror, the incomprehensible words, and the strange ripples on the mirror's surface kept replaying in his head. It wasn't just what he saw that disturbed him, but the feeling that he had witnessed something that should remain hidden, as if he had peeked into an ancient and dangerous secret. Pedro began avoiding night rides. He preferred to work during the day, where the sunlight and the city's hustle made the fears seem less intense. However, he couldn't stop thinking about the passenger and the mirror. The need to understand what was happening grew stronger each day, to the point where he started researching obsessively. He spent hours in front of the computer, searching for anything that could shed light on what he had seen. He searched for ancient symbols, incantations, mystical mirrors, urban legends, but the information was fragmented and confusing. It seemed like he could only find pieces of a larger puzzle, but none that really explained the connection between the passenger and the mirror. Then, one night when sleep seemed impossible, Pedro remembered the symbols on the warehouse door. Though faded and worn, he recalled some details. He went back to the internet, searching through obscure forums and occult websites. After a few hours of relentless searching, he found something that caught his attention. A series of symbols that resembled the ones he had seen. They belonged to an ancient ritualistic practice involving communication with the other side. They were said to be a way to summon entities or communicate with spirits through mirrors, which were seen as portals to the unknown. Pedro felt a chill as he read those words. Was the passenger trying to communicate with something through the mirror? And if so, what or who was he trying to connect with? The implications were disturbing, and Pedro felt a wave of fear hit him as he considered the possibilities. If the passenger was trying to open a portal and Pedro had witnessed it, could he himself be in danger? As these questions consumed him, Pedro began to notice that strange things were happening in his personal life. Objects continued to move around his apartment, appearing in places where he hadn't left them. The disturbing dreams intensified. He found himself trapped in a labyrinth of mirrors, each reflecting not just his face, but shadows and indistinct figures behind him, always out of focus. He felt that he was being watched, not just in his dreams, but in real life as well. It was as if an invisible presence was always around him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Pedro decided that he needed to confront his fears. He knew that the only way to understand what was happening was to return to the warehouse. The idea terrified him, but he saw no other option. The next night, Pedro drove to the outskirts of the city, his heart pounding, his hands sweaty on the steering wheel. The warehouse appeared in his sight like a menacing shadow against the night sky. He parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to gather the courage to get out. Every instinct screamed for him to turn around and leave, but the need for answers was stronger. Pedro walked towards the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. The door was ajar, as if waiting for him. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was as dark as before, but Pedro had brought a small flashlight with him. He turned on the beam of light and directed it around the empty space, searching for the mirror and the passenger. The place was silent, but the air felt heavy, thick with an invisible tension. Then he saw it. The mirror was there, leaning against the opposite wall. Pedro approached cautiously, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The surface of the mirror was dirty and dusty, but it still reflected the light back at him. Pedro stared at his own reflection for a moment, trying to see beyond it, to whatever the passenger had been trying to reach. Suddenly, he felt a cold wave sweep through the room, as if a gust of icy wind had passed by. Pedro quickly turned around, shining the light into the darkness around him, but saw nothing. When he looked back at the mirror, his eyes widened in fear. There was something there. A figure, indistinct and shadowy, appeared in the background of the mirror, almost imperceptible but definitely present. It seemed to move, rippling on the mirror's surface. Pedro instinctively stepped back, his heart pounding wildly. He knew that what he was seeing wasn't a trick of his mind. The presence in the mirror was real, and he felt a growing panic as he realized that it was trying to cross over to his side. Something malevolent, something the passenger had summoned. Pedro spun on his heels and ran out of the warehouse, his feet almost tripping over the debris on the ground. He burst into the cold night air, breathing heavily. As he ran towards the car, he felt the presence following him, something invisible pursuing him, a sense of imminent dread. He got into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine. He sped down the deserted road, glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something behind him. Nothing followed him physically, but Pedro knew that something had changed. Whatever was in that mirror was now aware of his presence, and he feared that the connection the passenger had established had somehow extended to him. Now, more than ever, Pedro felt that he was being watched. Something had been unleashed, and he was at the center of a dark and dangerous mystery. Pedro drove away, trying to escape the feeling that something was always one step behind, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. He knew he had crossed a line, and that the true nature of the passenger and the mirror was yet to be revealed. And as the car sped away from the warehouse, Pedro couldn't help but wonder if the real terror was yet to come. Pedro spent the following days in a constant state of alert. He had become a shadow of his former self, always peeking from behind the curtains of his apartment, making sure nothing was following him. The mirror in the warehouse and the shadowy figure he saw in its surface haunted his thoughts. Nights became unbearable. The dreams tormented him, and sleep grew increasingly scarce. Each night, he felt the darkness around him deepening, as if something was slowly pulling him into it. Fear and anxiety were on the verge of consuming him entirely when an idea struck him. Find the passenger and confront him. He needed answers, and the only one who could provide them was the man in the suit. Pedro decided that the next time the passenger requested a ride, he wouldn't let him disappear into a dark warehouse. Instead, he would try to talk to him, demand explanations. It didn't take long for the opportunity to arise. One night, while driving through the city center, the app pinged with a new ride request. The pickup location was once again that familiar spot. Pedro felt a mix of fear and determination. He accepted the ride and drove there. When he arrived, there was the man, standing under the dim streetlight, as if he already knew Pedro would come. The passenger got into the car silently, as usual, and Pedro began to drive. This time, however, instead of heading to an abandoned location, Pedro drove to a busier part of the city. The passenger didn't seem to mind the change of route. He continued staring out the window, as if nothing around him really mattered. Pedro gathered his courage and broke the silence. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling more than he intended. "What do you want from me? And what was that in the warehouse?" The passenger didn't respond. He just kept looking out the window, as if Pedro hadn't spoken at all. Pedro's frustration grew. He tried again, his voice now filled with desperation. "I know you're doing something there. I saw the mirror. I saw that thing. What are you trying to bring into this world?" He spoke faster and faster, his words tumbling out. Finally, the passenger slowly turned his head, looking directly at Pedro through the rearview mirror. His eyes were cold and empty, as if he weren't entirely human. Pedro felt a shiver run down his spine. The man opened his mouth to speak, and his voice was so low that Pedro had to strain to hear it. "You shouldn't have seen that," the passenger said, each word coming out slowly. "It wasn't meant for you. Now you're part of it." Pedro felt his blood run cold. Those words carried a terrible weight. He was involved in something much larger and darker than he could have imagined. Trying to maintain control, Pedro asked another question. "What did I see? Who or what are you trying to bring? And why?" The passenger didn't answer immediately. He seemed to ponder what to say next. When he spoke again, his voice was a low whisper. "What you saw is a shadow of something much older, more powerful than you can comprehend. I'm trying to open a portal, a passage for it to enter. It offers power, knowledge beyond human understanding. But there's a price to be paid. There's always a price." Pedro struggled to grasp what he was hearing. The idea of a portal for an ancient entity seemed absurd, but after what he had witnessed, he was willing to believe anything. He pressed on. "And why me? Why did you choose me for this?" The passenger gave a small, almost imperceptible smile that chilled Pedro to the bone. "I didn't choose you. The mirror chose you. It sees inside each of us and selects those who are most susceptible, those who have a connection, however small, to the other side. You were in the right place at the right time, or the wrong time, depending on how you see it. Now you're connected to it, just like I am." Despair welled up in Pedro. If it was true that he was now connected to this entity, how could he free himself? He needed answers, a way to escape this fate. "How can I break this connection?" he asked, almost pleading. "I don't want to be part of this." The passenger looked at him for a long moment before answering. "It's not that simple. Once the mirror chooses, it doesn't let go. The only way to free yourself is to complete the ritual or..." He paused, as if considering his next words. "Destroy the mirror. But destroying it could have unpredictable consequences. It might release what's trapped. Or worse." Pedro felt a knot form in his stomach. The options seemed impossible. Complete a ritual to bring an unknown entity into the world, or risk releasing something even more dangerous by trying to destroy the mirror. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. He couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. The passenger fell silent again, staring out the window. Pedro kept driving, not knowing where he was going, just driving. His hands trembled on the wheel, and his mind was a storm of fear and doubt. Eventually, the passenger asked to be dropped off on an empty street. Pedro stopped the car, and for the first time, watched the man step out and disappear into the darkness. This time, he didn't follow him. He needed to think, needed to decide what to do next. But one thing was certain. He could no longer return to his normal life. He was involved in something dark and ancient, and the choices he made from this point on could determine not just his fate, but perhaps something much greater. Pedro returned to his apartment, but he knew he wouldn't find peace there. He needed to prepare, needed to understand more. The warehouse, the mirror, the passenger, all of it was part of a puzzle he was now desperate to solve. And as he lay down, eyes fixed on the ceiling, a decision began to take shape in his mind. He would have to return to the warehouse, face the mirror again, and discover what was truly at stake, even if it meant confronting his worst fears. Pedro spent the following days immersed in a frantic search for answers. He studied everything he could about ancient rituals, occultism, and mystical mirrors. He found old texts, many of which were in languages unknown to him, and obscure forums discussing practices that seemed exactly like what the passenger had mentioned. With each discovery, the feeling that he was dealing with something immense and dangerous intensified. Finally, after days of research, Pedro found a text that seemed to describe a ritual related to mirrors. It was a complex and dangerous ritual that promised to open a passage to another dimension, but it also clearly stated the risks involved. He couldn't fully understand all the details, but one thing was evident. Completing this ritual was the key to any chance of freeing what was trapped in the mirror. One night, armed with the information he had gathered, Pedro decided it was time to face the warehouse again. The idea of returning to the place where it all began terrified him, but the need to resolve the situation and protect himself was greater. He drove to the warehouse, every minute of the trip filled with growing fear. When he finally arrived, the atmosphere seemed even more oppressive than before. The warehouse was as silent as the last time, but Pedro felt a presence, as if the building itself was aware of his arrival. He brought with him a small bag containing various items he believed were necessary for the ritual. Candles, red paint to draw the symbols, a small book with notes from his research, and a vial of holy water. He had read that holy water could be used to create a protective barrier against evil forces. It was an attempt to prepare for whatever might come. When he entered the warehouse, the first thing he did was check the mirror. The shadowy figure was still there, reflected in its surface. Pedro felt a chill down his spine, but he tried to ignore the sensation and focused on the ritual. Carefully, Pedro placed the candles around the mirror and lit each one. The faint glow of the flames created dancing shadows on the warehouse walls, and the environment seemed to change, as if the space was closing in around him. He then used the red paint to draw the symbols described in the ancient text, tracing them precisely around the mirror. Each symbol seemed to pulse with its own energy, and Pedro felt as though he was summoning something. With the symbols drawn, he opened the book and began reciting the words of the ritual. The words were in an ancient language, and the pronunciation was difficult and strange, but Pedro did his best to follow them as closely as possible. As he recited, the environment around him seemed to vibrate slightly, and the mirror began to emit a subtle glow. However, as Pedro continued, the candle flames began to flicker, and a cold wind started to blow inside the warehouse. The mirror seemed to respond, its surface rippling and agitating like the last time Pedro had seen it. The shadows in the room grew denser, and Pedro felt something approaching. When he reached the end of the ritual, Pedro felt a palpable presence in the room. The shadows shifted, and a sense of weight and oppression settled in. He looked at the mirror and saw that the shadowy figure was becoming clearer, almost as if it were materializing. Fear gripped him, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Suddenly, the figure began to move, and Pedro realized it wasn't just a reflection, but something that was trying to cross through the mirror. The glow intensified, and an invisible force seemed to push against him. Pedro realized the ritual was reaching its climax, and he braced himself for what might come next. A loud crash echoed through the warehouse, and the mirror began to crack. The crack spread across the surface, creating a complex web that seemed to expand and contract with its own energy. Paralyzed by fear, Pedro watched as the mirror shattered, and a guttural, desperate scream echoed through the room, as if something was being released or writhing in agony. The mirror continued to crack until, with one final snap, it shattered completely. The shards of glass fell to the floor, scattering across the room. The glow and force Pedro had felt before abruptly diminished, leaving the warehouse in oppressive silence. Pedro collapsed to his knees, exhausted and trembling. He slowly stood up, looking at the remains of the mirror. Whatever had been trapped there seemed to have been released, or at least it had lost its entry point into this world. The oppressive sense of presence had vanished, but Pedro knew the price had been high. He wondered if, by destroying the mirror, he had truly solved the problem, or if he had unleashed something even more dangerous. With difficulty, Pedro began to clean up the area, removing the candles and symbols. The warehouse was silent again, but the terror that filled it did not disappear. He knew the consequences of his actions might still manifest. The ritual and the destruction of the mirror might have released something that shouldn't be here, or perhaps the mirror had fulfilled its purpose, taking with it the forces the passenger had tried to invoke. Pedro left the warehouse with his mind full of doubts and worries. What he knew for sure was that his life would never be the same. He had become involved in something far greater than he had imagined, and the repercussions of his actions could be immense. And as he drove away, Pedro wondered if the true terror was yet to come, or if what he had faced was just the beginning of a darker journey. Pedro was so shaken that he could barely sleep after the destruction of the mirror. Each night seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the fear he felt had transformed into a constant state of alert. He tried to maintain a normal routine, but the events at the warehouse had left an indelible mark on him. The feeling of being watched never completely left him, and he often found himself checking behind him as if expecting something to appear at any moment. A month after that night at the warehouse, Pedro began to think that perhaps he had managed to move past the terror he had faced. Things seemed to be calming down, and he was able to partially resume his daily life. However, the feeling that something was still wrong never fully left him. One night, while driving home after a ride, Pedro received a message from an old friend. It was a simple text asking if he was okay and if he wanted to meet for coffee. Pedro hesitated for a moment. He hadn't seen this friend in a long time, and although he was reluctant to go out, the prospect of a friendly conversation seemed like a welcome relief from the loneliness he felt. He agreed to meet, setting a time at the local cafe where they used to hang out. The next day, Pedro went to the cafe. His friend Andre was there, waiting. When Pedro arrived, Andre greeted him with a friendly smile. They both sat down and started talking. Andre seemed cheerful and interested in how Pedro was doing. They talked about old times, and Pedro tried to distract himself from the unsettling memories of the warehouse. As they talked, Pedro noticed that Andre seemed particularly interested in one detail of his recent life. He was curious about why Pedro had suddenly withdrawn from his normal activities and why he seemed so tired and disturbed. Pedro tried to be vague in his answers, but Andre's concern only grew. "Do you have something to tell me?" Andre asked, with a genuinely worried expression. "You seem to be carrying a huge burden. If you need help, I'm here for that." Pedro hesitated, but he felt he needed to share a little of what he was going through, even if he couldn't reveal everything. He spoke briefly about an experience that had shaken him, without going into details about the mirror or the passenger. "Recently, I went through something difficult and scary. I can't explain everything, but I'm trying to deal with it," Pedro said. Andre listened attentively and seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Pedro was relieved to see that his friend wasn't judging him, but offering support. After some time, the conversation became lighter again, and Pedro was able to relax a bit. When they got up to say goodbye, Andre gave him a hug and wished him well. "If you need anything at all, let me know. Don't hesitate to call me," Andre said before leaving. Pedro left the cafe feeling a little lighter, grateful for the support of a friend. However, as the night progressed, a sense of unease began to settle in again. He returned home, but the feeling that something was wrong persisted. It wasn't just the fear of what might come, but a sense that there was something incomplete or unresolved. That night, as Pedro was about to sleep, he heard a strange sound coming from the living room. The noise was soft, as if something was moving, but when he checked, he found nothing out of place. He thought it might be stress playing tricks on his mind and tried to lie down again. However, things began to unfold in a disturbing way. During the night, he was awakened by a series of soft knocks on his apartment door. By this point, the fear and exhaustion had made him so sensitive that he jumped out of bed and went to the door with a racing heart. When he opened the door, there was no one there. The hallway was empty and silent. Pedro felt a chill run down his spine and decided he needed to investigate further. He started checking the apartment, but found no signs of intrusion or any explanation for the sounds. After making sure he was safe, Pedro tried to sleep again, but his rest was interrupted by a nightmare. He dreamed that he was back in the warehouse, with the mirror becoming increasingly dark and distorted. The passenger was there, looking at him with a sinister smile, and the sensation of being intensely watched woke him up in a cold panic. The following morning brought little relief. Pedro was exhausted and confused. He decided to investigate the warehouse again, perhaps to look for any clue he might have missed. However, when he arrived at the site, the warehouse was deserted and seemed as abandoned as before. He searched the place, but found nothing new. The mirror had been completely destroyed, and the warehouse seemed empty and lifeless. Pedro was about to leave when he noticed something unusual on the floor. Near the wall where the mirror had been, there was a small piece of glass that seemed to have a peculiar mark. He approached to examine the fragment more closely and noticed that it reflected an image that shouldn't be there. The image in the glass looked like an indistinct shadow, but very similar to the figure he had seen before. The glass fragment seemed to be emitting a faint vibration, and Pedro felt a growing sense of unease. He pocketed the fragment, determined to investigate it later. He felt there was more to discover, something that could explain the recent events and possibly help him understand what had truly been released. Pedro returned home, carrying the glass fragment with him. The feeling of being watched had returned in full force, and he knew there was still much to be resolved. Whatever was happening was far from over, and Pedro needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. Pedro spent the following days in a state of growing paranoia. The glass fragment he had found at the warehouse consumed his every thought. He spent hours trying to analyze the piece of glass, but despite his efforts, he couldn't understand what it was exactly, or why it emitted that unsettling feeling. He decided to seek help from a specialist in paranormal phenomena. He found a researcher who was known for dealing with unexplained cases and who was willing to examine the fragment. Pedro met with the researcher, an elderly man named Dr. Luis, who had dedicated his life to the study of unexplained phenomena. Dr. Luis carefully examined the fragment, using specialized equipment and techniques that Pedro didn't fully understand. During the examination, he remained silent, his expression a mixture of concentration and surprise. After some time, Dr. Luis finally spoke. "This fragment is from an ancient and powerful mirror," the researcher explained. "It has properties that can reflect not just light, but also hidden aspects of reality. What you're seeing is a reflection of something that doesn't belong to this world. It could be that the mirror was functioning as a portal or a window to another dimension." Pedro felt a chill run down his spine. Dr. Luis's explanation seemed to align with everything he had experienced, but it also heightened his fear of the unknown. He wanted to know more. "What do I do now?" Pedro asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Luis pondered for a moment. "The first thing you must do is ensure the fragment is kept safe. Don't leave it in a place where it can be easily accessed. Also, I suggest you perform an energy cleansing of the location where the mirror was. This could help neutralize any residual energy that might still be present." Pedro followed Dr. Luis's instructions. He thoroughly cleansed his apartment and his personal space, using techniques suggested by the researcher. Although the feeling of terror didn't completely vanish, the atmosphere felt a little calmer. However, Pedro still felt that something was missing, as if part of the story was incomplete. He decided to return to the warehouse one last time to investigate any clues he might have missed. He hoped the place wasn't entirely cleansed, in the hope of finding something that could help explain what had happened. When he arrived, Pedro noticed that the warehouse was surprisingly empty, as if nothing of significance had occurred there. He walked through the space, carefully examining every corner. However, when he reached the area where the mirror had been, he found a small box hidden under a pile of debris. The box was locked, and Pedro took some time to open it. Inside the box, Pedro found a series of old documents and a dusty journal. The documents appeared to be records from a former owner of the warehouse, someone who had studied and experimented with occult practices. The journal contained detailed notes about rituals and experiments with mirrors. Many of the practices described were similar to what Pedro had found in his research. The journal also contained a final entry, dated many years ago. The entry mentioned a ritual involving not just the destruction of the mirror, but also the need to seal any energy that might have been released. The author of the entry described the necessity of a final ritual to ensure that nothing that had been summoned could return. Pedro read the entry carefully, feeling a growing weight on his shoulders. He realized that although he had destroyed the mirror, he had neglected the final part of the ritual. The journal provided details on how to perform this final ritual to ensure that any residual energy was fully sealed. He returned home and prepared everything he needed for the final ritual, as described in the journal. He followed each step with the utmost precision, reciting the words and performing the necessary actions. The atmosphere around him felt tense, and Pedro was aware that he was doing something very important. When the ritual was completed, Pedro felt a wave of relief and exhaustion. The oppressive feeling that had haunted him seemed to have significantly diminished. Although he wasn't completely at peace, Pedro felt he had taken the necessary steps to resolve the issue appropriately. In the following days, Pedro noticed an improvement in his mental state. The sleepless nights decreased, and the feeling of being watched began to fade. He continued to investigate the glass fragment and study more about occult practices, but now with a calmer and more informed perspective. Although the terror he had faced couldn't be erased, Pedro had learned to deal with it and protect himself from future threats. The warehouse was left behind, a memory of a dark chapter in his life. What remained now was a sense of vigilance and a renewed commitment to never underestimate what cannot be fully understood. And so Pedro moved forward with a new appreciation for the fragility of reality and the importance of always being prepared for the unexpected.